New Year's Eve in Hollow Creek was always quiet. It wasn't the kind of town for big parties or fireworks. Most people stayed indoors, celebrating with family or watching TV. For me, the night was supposed to be peaceful, but it turned into something I'll never forget. I had agreed to watch my neighbor, Mrs. Emerson's house while she was away visiting her sister. Her house sat near the forest, far from the rest of town. She asked me to take care of her dog, Bailey, while she was gone. I thought it would be an easy job, feed the dog, water the plants, and relax. But things didn't go as planned. The snow started falling around 7 p.m. By 9 p.m., the yard was completely covered in white. Bailey had already run around, leaving little paw prints everywhere. I was sitting in the living room, reading a book by the fire. The wind outside made the windows rattle, but everything felt cozy and calm. At 11:30, I heard a strange noise. It sounded like a phone ringing. At first, I thought it was my cell phone, but it wasn't. The sound was coming from somewhere inside the house. It was an old-fashioned ringing, high-pitched and loud. But Mrs. Emerson didn't have a landline. Bailey's ears perked up and he started growling. "What's wrong, boy?" I asked, feeling uneasy. The ringing stopped for a moment, but then it started again, louder this time. It seemed like it was coming from the basement. My heart began to race. I didn't want to go down there, but the noise wasn't stopping. Bailey was staring at the basement door, his growl getting louder. I grabbed my phone and thought about calling Mrs. Emerson. She had mentioned hearing strange noises in the basement before, but she thought it was just the furnace acting up. I tried to convince myself that's all it was, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. Then I heard something else, a muffled voice. It was faint, but sounded like someone was speaking. Bailey barked, startling me. I decided I couldn't ignore it anymore. I grabbed a flashlight and a fire poker for protection, then opened the basement door. The air coming from the basement was freezing, much colder than the rest of the house. It smelled damp, like wet dirt. Bailey ran ahead of me, barking as he disappeared down the stairs. The ringing was louder now, echoing through the dark space. I slowly followed, shining my flashlight around. The basement was empty, except for a few boxes and old furniture. In the far corner, I saw it, an old rotary phone sitting on a wooden crate. The receiver was off the hook, hanging by its cord, and it was ringing. Bailey had stopped barking. He was standing next to the phone, shaking and whimpering. "Bailey," I called out, my voice shaky. I stepped closer, my flashlight shaking in my hand. The ringing stopped, and I heard a woman's voice. It was soft, but urgent. "Help me," she said. I froze. The voice sounded so real, but there was no one there. "Please, help me. He's coming," she said again, more desperate this time. Then the line went dead. Before I could move, I heard heavy footsteps in the darkness. They were slow and steady, coming from the far end of the basement. My flashlight flickered, and for a split second, I saw him. It was a tall figure, dressed in black, with a hood covering his face. He didn't move, just stood there watching me. My heart felt like it was going to explode. I grabbed Bailey and ran up the stairs as fast as I could, slamming the door behind me. My hands were shaking so badly I could barely lock it. The footsteps followed. I could hear them on the stairs, slow and deliberate. I grabbed my car keys, threw on my coat, and ran outside with Bailey. The snow was still falling, but I didn't care. I jumped into my car, started the engine, and sped away. As I drove, I looked back at the house. The basement lights were on, flickering like a candle. When Mrs. Emerson came home, I told her everything. She listened quietly, then nodded, like she already knew. "You're not the first," she said. "The phone has been down there since I bought the house. It rings every New Year's Eve, always with the same message." I asked her why she hadn't gotten rid of it, and she just shook her head. "Some things aren't meant to be touched," she said. That summer, I moved out of Hollow Creek. I still think about that night. Every New Year's Eve, I wonder if the phone rings again and who might be brave enough to answer it. If you enjoy real scary stories, subscribe to our channel so you don't miss out on our next chilling tale. Every town has its legends, and in our little Massachusetts town, it was Blackwood Manor, a sprawling Victorian mansion perched on a hill at the edge of the woods. It had been abandoned for decades. The story went that on New Year's Eve in 1922, the wealthy Blackwood family threw a grand party that ended in tragedy. Guests disappeared, screams were heard, and the next morning, the house was found empty. No bodies, no signs of a struggle, just silence. The house had been left untouched ever since. I wasn't the superstitious type, but when my friends dared me to spend New Year's Eve there, I couldn't back down. Emma, Jake, and Leah decided to join me, though they swore it was just to keep me company. The plan was simple. Show up at 9 p.m., explore, and leave after midnight. Easy, right? We arrived at the manor just as the snow began to fall. The house loomed over us, its broken windows like hollow eyes staring down. The front door creaked open as if it had been expecting us. Inside, the air was cold and stale, carrying the faint smell of decay. Our flashlights barely cut through the darkness. "This place is a dump," Jake said, kicking a chunk of plaster on the floor. "It's creepy," Leah whispered, sticking close to Emma. "It's just a house," I said, though I didn't believe it myself. We wandered through the grand hall, its walls lined with faded wallpaper and empty picture frames. The floor creaked under our feet, and the wind outside whistled through the broken windows. In the dining room, a long table sat covered in a dusty white cloth, as if waiting for a feast that would never happen. Chairs were scattered, some tipped over. "Let's check out the upstairs," Emma suggested. We climbed the staircase, the banister wobbling under our touch. The upper floor was even darker, the air heavier. We found a series of bedrooms, each more decayed than the last. One room had an old piano, its keys warped and broken. Leah pressed a key, and the sound echoed eerily. "This place gives me the creeps," she said. "Let's go back downstairs." As we turned to leave, we heard it. Music. Faint and distant, like it was coming from another time. It was an old waltz, the kind you'd hear at a fancy party. "What the hell?" Jake muttered. "It's probably the wind," I said, trying to convince myself. But the music grew louder, accompanied by muffled voices and laughter. It was coming from the grand hall downstairs. "Who else is here?" Emma whispered. "No one," I said. "There's no way." We crept back down, the music growing louder with each step. When we reached the bottom of the stairs, the grand hall was transformed. The chandeliers glowed with light, the floors gleamed, and the walls were lined with people in elegant 1920s attire. Men in tuxedos and women in flapper dresses danced and laughed, their faces strangely blank, like masks. "Are you seeing this?" Leah whispered, clutching my arm. "Yeah," I said, my voice barely audible. The crowd didn't seem to notice us. They moved gracefully, their movements almost mechanical. Then the music stopped. The room fell silent, and every head turned toward us. Their blank faces stared, their eyes dark and empty. "We need to go," Emma said, pulling at my arm. Before we could move, the crowd parted, and a man stepped forward. He was tall and pale, dressed in a black suit with a red pocket square. His smile was unnaturally wide, his teeth too perfect. "Welcome," he said, his voice smooth and cold. "We've been waiting for you." "We're leaving," Jake said, stepping back. The man shook his head slowly. "The party's just begun." The chandeliers flickered, and the room plunged into darkness. When the lights returned, the crowd was gone. The room was back to its decayed state, but the man was still there, standing just a few feet from us. "Run!" I shouted, grabbing Leah's hand. We bolted for the door, but it slammed shut before we could reach it. The man's laughter echoed around us, deep and mocking. The windows shattered, letting in a freezing wind that howled like a scream. Shadows moved across the walls, darting toward us. "Upstairs!" Emma yelled. We ran back up the stairs, our footsteps echoing in the empty house. The shadows followed, stretching and twisting like living things. We burst into a bedroom and slammed the door, pushing an old dresser in front of it. My chest heaved as I tried to catch my breath. Leah was crying, and Emma was trying to comfort her. Jake paced the room, clutching a broken chair leg like a weapon. The laughter continued, now coming from all around us. Then the door rattled. The man's voice came through, soft and taunting. "You can't hide," he said. "This house is mine, and so are you." The dresser slid away from the door as if pushed by an invisible force. The door creaked open, and the man stepped inside. "It's time," he said, reaching out a hand. In a panic, Jake swung the chair leg, but it passed through the man as if he were smoke. The room began to spin, the walls melting into darkness. I felt like I was falling, the air ripped from my lungs. When I woke up, it was daylight. We were outside, lying in the snow. The house was gone, not decayed or abandoned, just gone, as if it had never been there. The hill was empty, covered in undisturbed snow. We never spoke about that night. None of us could explain what happened, and none of us wanted to. But every New Year's Eve, I hear faint music in my dreams. An old waltz invited me back to the party. It was supposed to be a chill New Year's Eve. My friend Eric and I had planned to stay in, watch some movies, and count down to midnight with pizza and soda. Nothing fancy, just two friends killing time in a small suburban town. Eric had recently gotten into amateur radio, and his excitement was contagious. He'd set up a rig in his basement, a cluttered room full of wires, old radios, and a massive antenna outside that looked like something from a spy movie. "You've got to hear this," Eric said, motioning me over to the desk where his setup was buzzing and blinking. "What is it?" I asked, biting into a slice of pizza. "A pirate broadcast," he said, grinning. "I picked it up last night. Some station that's not supposed to be on the air. It's creepy as hell." I raised an eyebrow, curious but skeptical. "Creepy how?" "Just listen," he said, tuning the dial. The static crackled and popped, and then a faint, distorted voice came through. It sounded like a woman, her words slow and deliberate, as if she was reading from a script. "The clock strikes 12, she said. "When the old year dies, he will rise." The voice faded, replaced by static. Eric adjusted the dial, trying to bring it back, but the station was gone. "That's all I could get last night, too," he said, leaning back in his chair. "Weird, right?" "Yeah, weird," I said, though I didn't feel as amused as Eric did. Something about the voice made my skin crawl. We tried to laugh it off and went back to watching a cheesy horror movie. Midnight was still a couple of hours away, and the storm outside was getting worse. Snow hammered against the windows, and the wind howled like a living thing. I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched, though I chalked it up to the movie and the creepy broadcast. At 11:15, Eric got a hit on his radio. "It's back," he said, spinning in his chair and motioning me over. I hesitated, but eventually walked back to the desk. The static cleared, and the woman's voice returned. This time, it was louder, more distorted, and the words were clearer. "He walks among you," she said. "The hour is near. He will take what is his." "Okay, this is officially creepy," I said, crossing my arms. Eric was grinning like he'd struck gold. "This is insane. Do you know how rare it is to pick up something like this?" "I don't think we should be listening to this," I said. "Oh, come on," he replied. "It's probably just some prank or art project." The voice continued. "He sees you. He knows you." Then, silence. Eric tried to adjust the dials again, but the broadcast was gone. We both sat there for a moment, unsure of what to say. I glanced at the clock. It was 11:30. "Let's just watch the countdown," I said, heading back to the couch. Eric followed, though he kept glancing back at the radio like it might speak again. At 11:45, the power went out. The TV cut to black, and the only light came from Eric's battery-powered setup in the basement. "Great," I muttered. "Happy New Year, I guess." "Relax," Eric said. "We've got the radio." He flipped a switch, and the static returned. This time, the woman's voice came through almost immediately, and it was crystal clear. "He is here," she said, her tone flat and cold. "Welcome him?" The hair on the back of my neck stood up. I looked at Eric, who suddenly didn't look so excited anymore. "Turn it off," I said. "Maybe we should," Eric admitted. But before he could move, the static changed. It wasn't just white noise anymore. It sounded like breathing, heavy and deliberate. "Eric," I whispered. "I hear it," he said, his eyes wide. Then the voice returned, but it wasn't the woman this time. It was a man, deep and guttural. "I'm coming," he said. The signal cut out, leaving us in silence. Then we heard it, a loud bang from upstairs. "What the hell was that?" Eric whispered. "I don't know, but we need to leave," I said, grabbing my coat. Before we could move, the basement door slammed shut. Eric ran to open it, but it wouldn't budge. We were trapped. The banging continued, moving closer, like heavy footsteps coming down the stairs. "Do you have a weapon?" I asked, my voice shaking. Eric grabbed a wrench from his workbench and handed me a screwdriver. We stood there, backs against the wall, as the footsteps reached the basement door. Then everything went silent. The power flickered back on and the radio buzzed with static again. "Is it over?" Eric whispered. I didn't answer. My eyes were fixed on the stairs. Slowly, the door creaked open, revealing nothing but darkness. "Let's go," I said, pulling Eric toward the stairs. We bolted out of the basement, through the front door, and into the snow. We didn't stop running until we were in my car, speeding away from the house. Neither of us spoke the entire drive. When we finally stopped, Eric turned to me, his face pale. "That wasn't a prank," he said. I nodded, gripping the steering wheel. We never went back to the house. Eric sold his equipment a week later, and refuse to talk about what happened. But every New Year's Eve, I wonder if someone else will hear the broadcast and if they'll survive what comes after.